That's all very interesting about how particular ideologies, like racist ideologies, can actually feed into religions, especially if they have iconography and depictions of God, because then you can just entrench racism into your religion, like we saw with the caste system very much in India, which has kind of a class and a racist element, or classist / racist elements which go into making the different castes. And we've seen it in how white supremacists in recent history have used it with white Jesus, and really it really was demeaning to black people on a religious and spiritual sense. But I think it also comes into scientific philosophies. And I'm in particular here thinking about Charles Darwin, the eminent Victorian naturalist who is credited with co-founding the theory of evolution by natural selection. Do you know Darwin? Have we ever covered him before on this channel? He wrote some pretty, really genuinely quite racist things, and I haven't included anything from The Descent of Man here. These are just from a few of his letters. And he says, let's get it.
Are there more racist things in Descent of Man?
Oh yeah, lots. And that was published material as well. But this is particularly explicit. He says, very odd, there's accounts in India of the little hairy men. It is very, I don't know what that's in reference to. It is very true what you say about the higher races of men, when high enough, replacing and clearing off the lower races. In 500 years, how the Anglo-Saxon race will have spread and exterminated whole nations. And in consequence, how much the human race, viewed as a unit, will have risen in rank. So he's clearly saying that there are higher and lower races of man, and that in 500 years, he anticipated that the Anglo-Saxons will have extrapolated their progress from the 19th century and spread and exterminated whole nations, and how whole of humanity will have risen in rank. So that's like super racist and very eugenicist and very colonialist. Yeah, and genocidal. And he didn't seem to have any kind of issue with it. He's not saying, well, it'd be terrible and we shouldn't do that. He was kind of looking forward to it. And then we have, lastly, I could show fight on natural selection having done and doing more for the progress of civilization than you seem inclined to admit. Remember what risks the nations of Europe ran not so many centuries ago of being overwhelmed by the Turks, and how ridiculous such an idea is now is. The more civilized so-called Caucasian races have beaten the Turkish hollow in the struggle for existence. Looking to the world at no very distant date, what an endless number of the lower races will have been eliminated by the higher civilized races throughout the world, he said breathlessly. Yeah, and he's got this image of this like genteel kind of tortured naturalist, but and to an extent he was, but
tortured naturalist.
Yeah, he always looks like he's soul dead in all of his pictures. No comment as to why. But, I mean, this is really, really quite awful. Looking at the world at no very distant date, what an endless number of the lower races will have been eliminated by the higher civilized races. And as I said, Darwin was a racist and an armchair eugenicist. He didn't publicly advocate it, but he clearly supported it in spirit. But I think that's just because it was too new, to be honest. It was his half-cousin, Francis Galton, who formerly founded eugenics, but it was inherent in Darwinism and Darwin himself. And I've called out the Natural History Museum of London. I have about 2,000 followers. They have 2 million followers, probably why they haven't responded to me. But I've said, you have a statue of Darwin front and centre in your museum. In fact, you made it more central in 2009, replacing Richard Owens, who literally founded the museum. Richard Owen was basically a critic and a rival of Darwin's, who talked about that there are inherent forms which you can't explain through pure adaptation. But they took out Richard Owen's statues and they put in, or they moved it and they made Darwin front and centre. They said, do you care to comment on these statements of Darwin? Will the Natural History Museum publicly condemn them or stay silent? And finally, I've said, and before anyone says such views were inevitable for a Victorian, please note that Alfred Russel Wallace, who co-founded the theory of evolution with Darwin, completely disavowed such racism and eugenics by the end of his life. He was a social campaign extraordinaire, and this is the ever brilliant Alfred Russel Wallace. So this wasn't an inevitable view in his time.
It's a true story. He actually also made a really good Santa.
The original Kris Kringle. So I mean, what do you think about that? Did you know about these quotes before?
I didn't know about the quotes, so I was really surprised when I saw those on your Twitter feed. I was like, wow, this is something we never hear about.
Yeah.
But actually, it makes perfect sense.
Mm.
So, I mean, this is a man who came up, or didn't come up with, but at least formulated best the idea of, competition within a species with mutation and natural selection resulting in changes to that species and further evolution. So, he regarded humanity as being one among the animals.
Yeah.
And so it's only natural and a natural consequence of that belief that you would think about how is humanity going to progress further.
Yeah.
And, it's inevitable that that would happen through some form of warfare or conflict.
Mm.
I mean, it's called survival of the fittest.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I can see your point there, and I think it's, for me, it's not. He didn't, obviously, Darwinism perpetuated that racism, but I think there was obviously racism very much inherent in the Victorian civilization, in the Victorian era, as it is to a point today as well. But it was particularly prevalent then because then you're in the height of the British Empire with its colonialism, and they had to justify their often very horrific crimes to people around the globe. So it's interesting how it fed into the science of the time. And then it also became a perpetuating factor of racism. And we know about how, how Darwinism became social Darwinism through Galton, and then how that eventually fed into philosophies that led into essentially Nazism, and how the Nazis really championed eugenics. And made that their whole, raison d'etre. That was their whole thing, was to purify the gene pool and to make it to clean it for the Aryan race. So it's a very horrendous legacy of that idea.
Yeah, the Hadamar Institute is a great example of that. I can't remember how many thousands. I think it was 10,000 disabled people were put to death in the Hadamar Institute. So basically, you would have it was an institute in I can't remember the exact where it is located now, but it was in the region of Europe, and it was operated effectively by Nazi doctors who would then look at people who are disabled and things and make a judgment as to whether they basically should continue to live. And the great irony of this actually is what we've learned about molecular genetics since then, which is that when you actually the irony, other than it being absolutely a horrific thing to do and totally evil, it's actually self-defeating from a genetic perspective, because when you actually limit the gene pool, what do you get? You get the recurrence of recessive traits, which result in significant disease and effectively the wiping out of your own population. So by getting rid of people who they thought were so-called inferior, they were actually restricting their genetic pool and making it weaker, and more prone to disease and more prone to genetic issues long term.
And the whole thing is premised on the idea that species are not fixed, and that there's no essentialism to within a species, that everything is just a big blur of animals going from one species to the other, which led to people saying, well, there are certain peoples, i.e. black people, who are, something between, God forbid, the primates and humans, which was essentially what he's the idea that he's advocating here.